Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Morehead. If you don't know who I am, I'm a composer and I recently started this podcast. My guest today is Samuel Andreyev. He is, if you don't know who he is a composer based in France, originally Canadian. And I've been his student of composition for a couple of years now. He also has a popular YouTube channel and a podcast as well. So, the beginning of this conversation is more about himself and his interests, really. The second half of this podcast is a little more on the technical side. We talk about other composers and poets and photographers. So if you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Also, I've started a Patreon account. So you can join my Patreon account if you want, and there's multiple things you can sign up for there. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the video. Okay. Thank you, Samuel, for coming on the podcast.
No problem. Good to see you, Patrick.
Good to see you too. Um, so so first I wanted to kind of get out of the way. Well, so I'm a student of yours, and I actually came upon your work when like maybe 2 years before we actually met. So I knew of you for I guess for a little bit, and I came across your work by listening to just modern works, or not modern, but contemporary. And I was trying to find music that I could connect to that was uh, of this day and age, 21st century music, whatever you want to call it. And I remember I came upon À propos du concert de la semaine dernière and really enjoyed that work. Which that's an early work of yours, isn't it?
Depends on what you mean by early. It bisects my career. It's kind of in the middle between when I started and where I am now.
Mm-mm. Um, yeah, so that got me. I mean, I remember going through kind of a cycle of different composers, and that one specifically um, just hit home for me. And looked further into your work, and then came across your YouTube channel. Um, and so I was a fan, through your music, I guess, essentially before anything. And when I first emailed you, it was kind of like an act of desperation. I guess I was just out of high school,
That's
and
always a good reason to email somebody.
yeah, yeah, and I was just out of high school, and I didn't know what to do. Like, 'cause I knew I wanted to write music, as in the classical framework, I guess, and but I didn't know what my education path should be, to get there, and so uh, I looked at multiple things, like um, well, I mean, going to college, of course, but also, somehow maybe teaching myself some things, which I have sort of. But so yeah, really didn't know what to do. So I emailed you, and was surprised to get an email back very quickly. Actually, I think it was like the next day, and um, so I wanted to kind of ask you about what'd you think of that first email that I sent you? Because I asked initially if I could be your assistant, and you said, uh, well, you said like, no, but I can offer you lessons, basically. So I wanted to ask, what kind of went through your mind when you saw that?
Well, I can answer that generally, which is that I get a very large volume of emails, and I suppose I've developed a way of rapidly parsing them and trying to understand what the person writing to me is, either what the problem is that they're dealing with, and whether or not I might be able to help with that. Because there's a lot of people who write asking for either advice or lessons or who are having a professional problem of some kind or a technical problem. And sometimes I can't help for one reason or another, but sometimes it's possible. And um, I don't remember the specifics of the email you sent me, but if I wrote back quickly, it was because I sensed that, it would be possible to uh, help maybe through a process of dialogue or through looking at your work or something like that. So
Mm.
that's really what it is. And then, sometimes you write back and it turns out that you can't really be of much help, uh, or there's a major scheduling issue. I mean, one of the problems I always have to deal with in my teaching is that I live in France, and so there are lots of people who live in parts of the world where it's just from a practical standpoint, it's very difficult to find a time that's actually possible. So I used to have a lot of clients in Australia, for example, and that was always difficult. And then the west coast of the U.S. is also complicated, and because there's a 9 hour difference. So so there are lots of practical concerns, and or you might just not be the right teacher for somebody. That's also something that, So for every person that contacts me, there's, it's hard to put a number on it. I would say there's a lot of people where it ends up being either practically not possible, or I'm not the right person for them, or whatever. But that being said, one of the great things about teaching the way I do and the sorts of people that write to me is that typically they're already really familiar with my work and with my YouTube channel. That was the case for you. And so you already have a very strong idea of what I do and what I'm interested in, and what I can do before you even contact me. And that's a massive advantage because it means that, like, there's a kind of filtration effect, I suppose. Like, that you wouldn't write to me unless you were interested in those things by and large. And so it's much likelier in a sense that the people contacting me are doing things that are in alignment with the areas where I'm able to help. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but uh, hopefully that hopefully that responds to your question, at least vaguely.
No, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember kind of like, well, I mean, I wrote a very lengthy email to you, and just basically begging to be your assistant. I remember that's how it kind of read out. And initially I thought you were in Canada, so I thought you were closer. But yeah. Um, one thing I want to do, so I was listening to some of your work, and and I listened to your cantata, Iridescent Notation, and or that's with an S, I believe, Iridescent Notations. Um,
Singular. It's
Singular.
singular.
Right,
Iridescent
sorry.
notation.
Yeah, yeah, that cantata. And I was wondering what your, I mean, of course you didn't write the um text for it, but it's a very odd one, to say the least. And um, so I wanted to ask you what is your literary influences? Um, yeah, because it
Oh,
seems
that's a great question.
yeah,
Hmm.
it seems to me with your works that deal with text, they're very particular. Yeah.
They are, yeah. They're not the sorts of things you would normally set to music. I've written two cantatas so far. So there's Iridescent Notation, which is based on texts by Tom Raworth. And Tom Raworth was one of the preeminent modernist British poets, active mainly from the 70s until his death, which I believe was around 2016, I think.
Mm.
And then the second one, which is more recent, is called In Glow of Like Seclusion. And that piece is based on poems by another British modernist poet, Jeremy Halvard Prynne, J.H. Prynne, Prynne. And I had the opportunity to meet both of those individuals. Prynne is still very much alive and still publishing. And Rayworth was still very active at the time that I wrote the cantata, at least the first version of the cantata, since I revised it, and unfortunately he was never able to hear the second version because he had passed away in the meantime.
Mm.
But in any case, as for my literary interests, I had the tremendous fortune to be a young man, a young artist in Toronto in the 1990s. And in a sense, I suppose you have to be lucky, right? Because sometimes there's a scene that coalesces at a particular time where you happen to be there. And when that's the case, then, it's like you're in fertile soil in a sense. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. I think right now in particular is not a particularly auspicious time to be in Toronto. But at that time it was, or at least that's how it seems to me. Of course, my vision is probably somewhat biased. But anyway, at that time, there was a remarkably active um, group of writers that was just so much fun to hang around with. And I was probably, when I first fell into that crowd, I was probably about 15. I was much younger than all the others. Um, and I fell into it kind of by accident. And actually, what happened was when I was really young, like a little kid, I was really into the whole sort of fanzine culture, which was a big thing at the time. Of course, that's all been displaced by blogs and YouTube, and it doesn't really exist as a culture to the same extent. But at that time, if you wanted to find out about what was happening culturally, outside of the mainstream, then you would read these small publications that were made in very, very small runs and distributed through local bookshops and distributed through the mail and stuff like that. And then there were reviews. Like there's a magazine called Fact Sheet 5, for example, that was a huge compendium of all the people who were doing this kind of work. So you could get their addresses and get reviews of their periodicals that they were publishing and
Mm.
and order them that way. So anyway, I fell into that kind of world, and then that led me to the underground literary scene in Toronto at around, this is around 1996, 97. So I was still in high school at the time. And so I just found out about all kinds of things just by hanging out with these people and talking to them and figuring out what they were reading and what was interesting to look at and who was doing good work. And they were amazingly welcoming as a community, and it was a great time. So, for example, I was able to meet Tom Rayworth when he came through town. There was a party at the house of a local poet called Victor Coleman, to which I was invited, and Tom Rayworth was there and did a reading, and so I got to meet all of these amazing people. And I was instinctively drawn very early on to things that were on the more experimental edge of the spectrum, you might say. And that's probably for psychological reasons. I score off the charts in trait openness, and it's neither good nor bad, but that's just how it is. And people who are like that tend to crave stimulation and novelty, and they're always on the outlook for something new and fresh and exciting. So that was the case, and I would be interested in anything as long as it broadened my horizons. So I would engage with it first and then ask critical questions later, right? So I wasn't too preoccupied with, is this good or is this bad? It was just a matter of, have I seen this before? Is this new? Is this interesting? Um, so consequently, I read lots and lots and lots of, I guess, what would be called avant-garde poetry from quite a range of different traditions and styles and different parts of the world. And that really formed a big part of my outlook and my aesthetic attitudes from an early age. So that was always the kind of stuff that interested me to set to music, partly because not too many people do it, first of all. I remember when I was a student at the Paris Conservatory, I noticed that uh, whenever French composers would set English language poetry, it was always either um, Gerard Manley Hopkins or Emily Dickinson. It was like those were the two options. That was all they knew, and so they just kept, like there were so many cantatas and song cycles and based on Emily Dickinson.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, in the English speaking world, it's the same. It's like there's a relatively small circle of poets, T.S. Eliot, that everybody sets. So I
Mm.
didn't want to do that. I didn't want to, set the same poets that everybody else was doing. And secondarily, I wanted to set things that really posed a massive creative challenge, where the solution to how you would put it to music wasn't obvious, because you can't illustrate it. Like a lot of what happens in text setting is like a lot of composers, whether instinctively or unconsciously, they'll attempt to illustrate the poem musically. So they'll either try to uh, present it as a narrative, or if there are specific features of the poem that talk about, a bird or whatever it might be, or the sea, then they'll try to come up with sounds that evoke those things musically. And I wasn't interested in doing that either. So the poems of Rayworth and Prynne, in particular, really resist that kind of treatment because what they do is they present you with this glittering object that won't settle, right? And so every time you reread their poems, it's different. You get a different reading. Like there's a general feeling to it that is, something you can grasp intuitively, but it's very, very difficult to pin down a specific meaning. And that was enormously exciting because it's like, how do you set something like that without completely flattening it out? So that was more interesting to me. And obviously, when you do that, the risk of failure is way greater, right? So you know that it's likely that you'll fail, that the cantata will either not do justice to the poems, or it will be incomprehensible, or whatever. Like there's all kinds of risks associated with that. But you have to do the things that grab you by the lapels and won't stop. It has to come from a kind of compulsion, and that was the case with those poets. I spent in both cases, I spent years reading everything I could get my hands on, reading it multiple times, analyzing the texts, meeting the poets personally, talking with them, trying to understand what they were up to, and trying to formulate a musical response to it.
Mm-mm. So, so as you advanced as a composer, um, were those just striking poets because you did get to meet them, and they made an impression on you? Were you just genuinely, I guess, interested in them?
I would have been interested in them either way,
Mm.
but there's no question that it helps if you meet somebody. It makes it more immediate and palpable, and having a human connection, is obviously a very powerful thing. And I should point out there are lots of other poets that I wanted to set as well, or that I still want to set. And sometimes it doesn't work for reasons that have nothing to do with the work or nothing to do with the music. For example, there are poets that I'd like to set, but they only write extremely long poems, and it's just not practical to set them.
Mm.
Or there might be something with respect to the type of language they're using that just doesn't isn't just not compatible with my musical outlook for one reason or another. Or it could be the subject matter, or there could be rights issues, surrounding the estate, all kinds of things. So that being said, I have actually written a much more recent song cycle. I wrote it about 3 months ago
Mm.
on poems by a very old friend of mine called Daniel F. Bradley. And Daniel F. Bradley is a Toronto poet who writes work that I would describe as a kind of urban lyricism. It's a little bit grittier and hard edged, maybe, than some of the other things I've done. Um, but it's beautiful work. It's exquisite work, and I've known Daniel for close to 30 years. And I had the idea that I'd like to set his work at least 15 years ago, and that's how long it took, to figure out a way around, what do I do with his words. So, I'm comfortable with the fact, out of necessity, that sometimes it takes a very long time.
Yeah, right, right. So, so iridescent notation though I mean, because you have an album of the same name, so the cantata. Um, that the text. I mean, reading that back, it seems very challenging to put that to music. I guess what did you go through when because I imagine it took a long time to do that work.
Well, I started by analyzing the poems really closely, and I did that for months before I even started to think about writing a single note of the score. And I remember there's a poem in there called come back, oh glittering in white," which is a pretty early poem of Tom's, and he wrote that in the 1960s. And as part of my process, I wrote that poem out longhand probably 50 times, partly because I wanted to memorize it. And so every day I would sit down and try to write it out until I could do it effortlessly. And I had completely, memorized the entire poem. And I wanted to be able to hold it in my mind as a whole thing and rapidly scan through it and imagine different ways of presenting it. And, that kind of approach really does take a lot of time.
Yeah.
With some of the other poems, I analyzed them in order to try to figure out what their constituent parts were and how they related to each other. Because one of the things Tom does is he, and you have to hear him read his poems to get a sense of this. Uh, he reads really quickly, and it's like his readings are full of sudden U-turns and contrasts and him interrupting himself. And like that's what the poetry is like. It's these little shards that kind of come at you at incredible speed. And you like it's too fast for you to pick them all up and figure out how everything relates to everything else. And that's part of the point. Like he's interested in this kind of this excess, this kind of sensation of uh, not being able to keep up as you read the poem. And it's like having a conversation with someone who's enormously brilliant and comes up with one incredible idea after the other, but it's so fast that you can't keep up with it. That's what the poems are like to me, and that's a sensation that I think is fairly unique to Tom. Like he really nailed that type of poetry.
Mm-mm.
But it also means that the poems don't easily coalesce as a single thing or having a central theme necessarily. So I had to read each one and pull them apart and try to see, is there a commonality of reference here? Is there something formal he's doing? Is there a connection between all of these phrases? And then I would go over them with a pencil and say, oh, okay, this bit here seems to relate to this, and there seems to be a connection between this and this, and then that allowed me to try to imagine a kind of provisional musical uh, structure or a musical response to the poem that would amplify and convey its basic characteristics. So that's what I tried to do. There's a kind of flickering quality to Tom's poetry where it seems to rapidly go in and out of focus, or it seems to be sort of scattering left and right very quickly before your eyes. And one of the things I tried to do in the cantata was to create that sensation of, well, as the title says, iridescent notation. The idea being, iridescence refers to things that the the way they reflect light will change depending on the angle at which you view them. And the idea is that his poems are kind of like that. So I tried to create music that would convey a similar sense of multiplicity and rapid changes of color and rapid changes of texture, and but still be coherent, as pieces. So that was very challenging.
Mm-mm. Yeah, I mean, just looking at your body of work and talking to you, um, I mean, there's an immediate sense of precision in your work, um, as far as trying to imagine, I guess, how uh, a thing like that would be constructed. I mean, even just really any of your pieces. And where do you think this idea of precision uh, with regards to writing a piece, like from say the very beginning uh, of writing a piece, um, where did that come from, do you think?
Well, all art, in a sense, all all authentic art stems from pathologies that have been turned into positive qualities. So artists, generally speaking, are not normal people. And all the artists that I know, all the really committed artists, there's something wrong with them on some level.
Mhm.
So they all suffer from various manias. It could be, ADHD like symptoms. It could be OCD like symptoms. They could be hysterics. Uh, there's something a little bit off about them as people. If you were, completely normal and well-adjusted and average, you wouldn't be an artist. You'd do something else. You'd have more sense than that. So, uh, in my case, the precision is probably a manifestation of my obsessive character, and
Mm-mm.
the art is a way of channeling that into something productive, hopefully. But one of the realities of that is that, it's like it's a little bit what I alluded to earlier. You get seized upon by an obsession,
Yeah.
and you have to tunnel through it. That's the only option. And you don't necessarily get to choose what the obsession is. So in the case of those cantatas, the Prin one in particular took 2 years. It was really, really arduous. It was very difficult to write. But you become seized with a vision, and then you'll drop everything to pursue it and to try to turn it into something. And it has to be a certain way, and you have to try to get it, the way it needs to be. And um, I think one of the results of that is I'm not particularly spontaneous as an artist, or at least I've had to try to find a balance between, well, a certain necessary degree of spontaneity, because if you're absolutely not spontaneous, it's difficult to write anything. But let's say a balance between that and this and the fact that my work just seems to take a long time to crystallize.
Mm-mm.
So there will be lengthy periods where you're searching for something, and you intuit that it's there, but you can't quite grasp it. And there's a lot of trial and error, and it seems not to be going anywhere. And you'll get little fragments, but they won't coalesce into a piece. And then suddenly, it just snaps into focus, and there it is. And the thing is, I would love it if it snapped into focus immediately, every time, but it never does.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process. And when I was in my 20s, that was very difficult to accept because I wanted to finish pieces and move on to the next one. And I just, that didn't work. And it was always this kind of very arduous process. And now that I have a little more experience, I'm more accepting of that. And I've come to understand the way that works. And I don't freak out if I can't find the key to finishing a piece right away.
Mm. So on that subject, what can you describe what it's like when it does snap into focus?
Everything becomes clear and simple and easy. And then you just sit down and write it.
Mm.
And when that happens, I can often finish a piece in a matter of days. But until it happens, it's like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle that has 15,000 pieces, and they're all basically the same shape and color.
Right.
So it's kind of daunting. And then
Yeah.
suddenly there it is.
Mm-mm-mm. So I mean, this question I guess is more for uh, composers or writers of music or being stuck in the material process. Is something that well, I guess I don't know if every composer suffers from that, but do you think that is has something to do with your process, or just kind of non-existent? Because I mean, I can get stuck on an idea for days, and um, it can't really um, yeah, I don't know. It's like waiting for something to happen, like you're describing, but uh, yeah.
Well, you have to condition yourself to appreciate the process and ideally to enjoy it. Because if you're completely obsessively fixated on uh, the result of the process, or having a very precise idea of what you want, and then uh, getting very frustrated if that doesn't happen, then it's very difficult to advance as an artist. And I've had that with many students of mine actually over the years who have become stuck actually because they're very, very specific about what they want, but then it doesn't work out the way they want, and they don't sort of adapt on the fly. Rather, they get frustrated and then they become blocked, and then the piece goes nowhere. And so one of the things that I've sort of painfully learned is that the process is really critical. It's really key, and you have to be the sort of person who enjoys and is drawn to sitting down and working every day without necessarily giving too much of a thought to what's going to come out of this activity.
Yeah.
I say that with a grain of salt, obviously, because there are situations where you've got a deadline or you've got a commission to write, and it does have to be done. But by and large, if you focus primarily on the process rather than the results of the process, in my experience, things tend to go better. And that also means that you're more likely to be able to, if you need to tear things up halfway through and start over again. It's not gonna bother you as much because you're not married to the idea that it's like, no, I have to keep what I've done, or I can't, I can't waste this effort that I've already put into it. So, but these are things that take a long time to internalize, and in a sense, it can be helpful sometimes to have a teacher to remind you of these things, but you have to really experience them and internalize them, I think, to to appreciate them. So, these days in particular, I don't even worry too much whether, yeah, I could work for 3 months and end up with nothing, or I could end up with a piece that I end up rejecting, and I'm okay with that. Um, not that I prefer that to happen, but if it does happen, then it's not gonna, it's not gonna be a big catastrophe.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. So maybe jumping back to uh, your time in Toronto. Um, you started making albums quite early, right? And I mean, first of all, they were within a pop framework. You know, they were pop songs, right? And so, what was it? I was wondering what, because you stopped for a while when you're pursuing your classical works from making the idea of making an album, and um, so what was the, I guess, motivation to put that same effort into your more classical works?
You have to start with where you are and what you have around you. That's what everybody has to do. So, in my case, there was a sense of working with the most immediate to hand types of materials, which were vernacular popular music styles. However, I would not call any of that work pop music because it's way too weird for that. And if anyone uh, doesn't believe me, you can just go on my YouTube channel. I actually released one of those songs on the channel about, it was a long time ago, maybe 8 years ago. And it's called something like My Insane Pop Music. And there's a song there that I wrote and recorded when I was 18 years old. So that'll give you a sense. And it's not even remotely recognizable as a pop song, but there's a kind of vague outline of a song-like form, and I do sing, so it's a kind of a singer-songwriter type of approach. But in that case, it's a fully written out instrumental composition with a vocal part that I perform myself, and I recorded that in my home studio at the time.
Hmm.
That work is it's the work of somebody trying to absorb a language and also express a very idiosyncratic vision. And I'm making no claims whatsoever as to the quality of any of that work, and most of it should not be heard by anybody. But it was an enormously useful process to go through because in the span of about maybe 5 years, I think I did this very intensively between when I was about 15 and maybe when I was 19, 20. During that time, I wrote hundreds of songs, wrote and recorded them, sang them, arranged them, played many, many different instruments, and I also got friends to play additional instrumental parts. And in some of the more ambitious later projects, I hired people, local professional musicians, to play string, wind, brass, percussion parts, and did all the arranging and the producing and the engineering and all of that. So that was like a very condensed kind of education that really sharpened my ear. And because it was so intense, I was constantly writing, constantly recording, constantly experimenting and trying things out. I learned an enormous amount during that period. Uh, and when I was 18, I started studying composition formally. And that made me more acutely aware of the limits of the sort of language that I was writing in. And in addition to which, the songs I was writing were getting so far from anything that you could conceivably consider to be a pop song that it was a very logical next step to just abandon that pretension altogether. And part of that had to do not so much with the content of the work as the style and the manner in which it was presented. So in Toronto at the time, I had a band, and we performed locally in clubs, and that in order for that to be possible, that it had to be stuff I could sing. It had to be possible to play it with the instrumentation that we had, and you had to be able to do a set and all that kind of thing. It was more a question of the environment in which the songs would be heard. But it was always totally idiosyncratic personal kind of work that was never there was never any commercial intention behind any of it. And I think it would have been essentially impossible to try to turn that into a commercial enterprise because the work was just way too weird for that.
Mm-mm. Yeah, I mean, the reason I say pop was because I only heard, well, I think that's the only one that's publicly available, maybe, but the, the Tubular West album, and
Hmm.
that kind of has, uh, it's there's no big like string arrangement or anything in that piece, so uh, yeah, the pieces you were talking.
Yeah, that album is um, how do I describe it? What happened is I did in 1999 or 2000 I did an album called Songs of Elsewhere, which was released as a CD at the time, and that was kind of the last gasp, I suppose, of that period of my life. And immediately after the conclusion of that project, I moved to France, or very very soon afterwards. And then that was that, as far as I was concerned. That was kind of the end of a chapter, and I was, obviously happy to have made those projects and to have learned a lot from them, but I wasn't interested in pursuing it. But what happened was there were a bunch of unfinished odds and ends, and then ideas that I kept persistently getting that were sort of like the tail end of all of that. And I had a nagging sense that, there's some unfinished business in this direction. It's not done. There are things that I now know how to do that I didn't know how to do at the time. There are ways of developing this language that hadn't occurred to me at the time. And then the other thing that started to happen was I started to become friends with performers who had their feet in both worlds, so to speak, who were classically trained players, but who were also really interested in rock and vernacular music. And what happened is a bunch of them started saying, "Well, what? I can't understand why you would just completely drop this as a pursuit and only do, concert music." And so that got me thinking because suddenly I had people around me who were interested in that approach and were ready to help out if I wanted to pursue it. Plus, I had all of these loose ends and a real sense that this isn't done. And eventually, circumstances just came together in a way that made it possible to imagine doing another album. And this also dovetailed with a period where I was studying at IRCAM in Paris and getting interested in the possibilities of electronic music, and also a period in my work where I was really preoccupied with uh, rare historical instruments and unusual combinations of timbres. And all of that just kind of came together. And we had the possibility of working in a nice studio in Paris with a brilliant engineer called Nicolas Dufournet. And Steve Venwright, an old friend of mine from Toronto, managed to get some funds together for us to do this. And he flew over, and we did the album. We did the album in Paris, and I'm
Mm,
really glad we did it. It's a completely insane project, impossible to sell, impossible to commercialize. But it needed to happen. You know, it was ready to emerge, I suppose, and the team was there and the circumstances were there, and so we just did it.
mm. Yeah, I was gonna say you're starting to sound a little bit like Frank Zappa, a little bit. But but has do you think contemporary music has gotten too intellectual?
I don't find most of it to be intellectual at all.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, I mean, I guess I say that because a lot of the a lot of the popular works now, contemporary works are have a lot of, it focuses a lot on extended techniques, and and I don't know, maybe it's like um a thin veil they're trying to, or they do upon whatever they're trying to do.
Yeah,
Um,
but that's not contemporary music. The extended techniques thing came out of the 1960s. So
right.
that's 60 years old. So that's not contemporary. When you see composers who are obsessed with contemporary with extended techniques, what they're doing is they're extending a project that began 6 decades ago. Um, that's the opposite of contemporary. Like that's not the music. It's not the music of today. It's the music of the post-war era that for some reason refuses to die, or it refuses to die in academic circles. But you have
Yeah.
to remember that that music has no broader cultural resonance, right? It's very much a closed circuit, and it's an extreme niche activity that interests a small number of people, most of whom are professionals and experts, and that's it as far as I'm concerned. I'm not very interested in most of it.
Yeah. I mean, I just say that because it is quite popular, at least. I mean, uh, um, I guess, for example, like looking when I discovered your music, I also discovered like Olga Neuwirth and Marc Andre,
Yeah,
composers.
but those people began their careers 30 years ago.
Right, I guess that's
I
true,
mean,
but
and
you see, I mean, I see younger people now trying to imitate that. But yeah.
yeah, I find that peculiar. I
Hmm.
mean, the world we live in is so utterly different and transformed from the era of, when Lachenmann began his career. We're just in it's a quantum leap. The world that I now inhabit is unrecognizably different from the world that I grew up in, like when I was 12 or 13 before the internet.
Yeah.
Um, so it's just odd to me. It's odd to me that younger composers would look to the work of two or three generations ago. Um, that's incidentally, to be clear, that's not a comment on the quality of the work of those composers.
Right.
Um, I knew Marc Andre. I had a few lessons with him actually, and I always enjoyed his work. Actually, I thought he was a really interesting artist, and I really enjoyed meeting him. And Lachenmann is a great composer. Period. End of discussion. He's a great composer. The question is more, what is going on culturally that we keep perpetuating these models of transgressive avant-garde music that have their origins in an era that is long gone. I find that a little bit peculiar.
Can you further comment on that?
Well, my view is that contemporary music has gotten stuck in the universities.
Yeah.
and also in particular models of funding that have a set of incentives associated with them, and that it's not necessarily the authentic expression of a culture, but it's because of a kind of excessive institutional stranglehold on the infrastructure of the music world.
Mm-mm.
And I think that that has caused things to slow down and to get stuck. And it's also created a very either artificial or non-existent relationship between the artists, the people funding them, and the public. And I don't think that's particularly healthy.
Yeah. Mm-mm-mm. Well, I mean, this might be. I mean, I had a few stupid questions. That. Well, I mean, they might be. I thought they might be. Yeah, like smart or dumb. So, do you think Western music is based on harmony?
Well, Western music has two characteristics that I think define it more or less as an enterprise, or at least have done. And one of them is the advent of the score, the five-line staff, and the possibilities that that's opened up in terms of the technique and the language of Western music. And the second thing, which is downstream of that, which it's downstream of the five-line staff, is polyphony. And
Yeah.
it's other cultures have different forms of polyphony, and many other cultures also have music notation that they've developed. But I would argue that those two characteristics, so polyphony, in other words, the bringing together of rhythmically and melodically distinct voices within a coherent harmonic framework, and the capacity to write down complex rhythmic and and precise pitch organizations, uh, has been developed arguably to a greater degree in the Western tradition than in other traditions, which have tended to have other focuses.
Hmm. How important is analysis for a composer?
It depends on the composer. It was very important for me. It was one of the main ways that I learned composition. I think that uh, in terms of what's useful for a composer to know, I think that counterpoint is number one, because counterpoint teaches you all kinds of things that are highly generalizable across pretty much any conceivable musical style. So it tells you how to conduct a line, how to conduct a texture, how to join lines together, how to make a how to make a coherent texture, how to orient a piece of music so that it has a sense of direction to it, how to bring together the horizontal and the vertical in a coherent way. Um, and none of those things are particularly stylistically dependent. In other words, they can apply to virtually any type of music, any type of style, any genre. So counterpoint actually teaches you how to compose. Now, there's certain things that it doesn't do. It doesn't teach you about large scale form, for example. It doesn't teach you about orchestration, obviously, but it's a very, very useful starting point technically.
Hmm.
The study of harmony is useful, but to my mind, it's less useful, generally speaking. And the reason for that is if you look at any undergraduate textbook on harmony, usually what you'll get is a chronological uh, tour of diatonic harmony. So it'll start with relative, how do you join two or three chords together? How do you make a 1-4-5 progression? How do you write a cadence? And then it will take you through chords that have a slightly more complex function: secondary dominants, augmented sixth chords, Neapolitan sixth chords, diminished seventh chords, augmented triads, and so on. It'll take you through enharmonic equivalents and all of the things you can do with that. And then it'll take you through the 19th century, more chromatic harmony, altered chords, vagrant tonality. It'll take you into the 20th century usually, and it's arranged chromatically. And with each of these concepts, they'll provide a little excerpt from a piece. So it'll be like, okay, well, here's how Mozart uses the augmented sixth chord. Here's how Schubert modulates. Here's an example of Brahms using the diminished seventh chord or whatever.
Yeah.
And it takes the form of a dictionary of past practices. So you'll get a little 3 bar excerpt of a thing. And the student will have to do things like write out a diminished seventh chord and show all the different ways that it can resolve in different keys. So if you take this tone and raise it by a semitone, then you end up here. And if you take the bottom tone and do this, then you end up in this key. And you learn how to do all of that. But that doesn't teach you actually how to compose. It teaches you how to assimilate aspects of past languages. Uh,
Hmm.
but it doesn't necessarily tell you things that you can generalize and turn into a personal style.
Yeah.
So it has its limitations. Whereas counterpoint isn't exactly it's not a dictionary of past practices, but it can tell you things that are more generalizable.
Hmm.
As for analysis, what analysis can do when it's done really well is to show you here are some compositional problems and here's how composers have dealt with them in the past and here's the decisions they've had to make and here's how they've organized their material and how they've set up their forms. And when you do that enough and look at enough pieces and look at enough different historical eras and then it can just bring you a lot closer to the actual handicraft of composition and it can give you some strategies that might be useful in your own work, or at least it can teach you how to think like a composer, and that can also be really really useful. And next to those 3 disciplines, counterpoint, the study of harmony, and analysis, the teaching of composition itself um, is a little bit more nebulous. It's a little bit harder to define exactly what should happen in a composition lesson.
Right.
But typically, people who are taking composition lessons have already assimilated at least some of that. And typically, they also play an instrument. So they have, they can read music, they can sight read, they understand basic harmony and counterpoint, usually, right? Normally, you learn at least some of those things before you study composition.
Yeah.
And then, in principle, you can focus on questions of, how do you work with material? How do you develop it? How do you make a form? Uh, and but it has to be very individually tailored because I've worked with hundreds of composition students now. I've been teaching for 15 years and I've never met 2 students that were alike. They always have very, very specific individual uh, both challenges and also things that they need to learn and highly individual projects of things that they're interested in. So you really have to take it on a case by case basis.
Mm-mm-mm. Again, this might be a dumb question, but what do you think of Schenker? I wanted to get your opinion on this.
Ah, that's interesting. I never studied Schenkerian analysis. I had like probably 2 courses in it when I was studying analysis, just as a part of a broader overview of different analytical methods and tools. But I didn't go through the sort of course in Schenkerian analysis that is, very commonly taught in North America. I think that Schenkerian analysis is mainly taught in the U.S. Uh, and not very much at all in Europe. So all of my education took place in France. So I just didn't have much contact with it. And I still don't. I've never particularly felt like I needed to look at it very closely. And that could be my loss, but you're the product of a particular education system, I suppose. And
Yeah, right, right.
there are, there are limits to what you can do.
Mm-mm. Yeah, that's definitely what one thing that was shocking to me for one of our first lessons or first couple lessons is that yeah, you really didn't t touch on any of those topics that I guess Schenker was worried about or concerned with, which was refreshing. Since you because I know you have I know you have a good uh how should I put it good knowledge of Eric Satie. And I was wondering, um, how should one uh, or what can a person get out of listening to Eric Satie?
Well, he was very funny, first of all, which is
Right.
not a quality that's necessarily hugely present in the music of the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
Mm-mm.
But he had a very charming and off-kilter sense of humor. Uh, the pieces don't take themselves too seriously. They're innovative in various ways, and a lot of that comes out of the fact that he was reacting against the then prevalent late 19th century Germanic aesthetic. Uh, and Satie, in common with Debussy, they both were very much sort of French chauvinists. In other words, they were very proud of their distinct culture and wanting to produce work that came out of that. And to the extent that they were actively opposing themselves to Germanic aesthetics.
Mm.
And one of those aspects is the highly directional, teleological, the always pushing forward nature of 19th century German music, where it's strongly directional, it's strongly developmental also in its orientation. And as the 19th century wears on, the harmony gets more complex, the textures get thicker, and there's this kind of obsession with with the sublimity of nature,
Mm.
a kind of uh, spiritualistic focus on nature. And you get none of that in Satie. It's the opposite of all of that. Instead of writing these massively lengthy, complex scores with increasingly chromatic harmony and this push towards the sublime, rather than that, with Satie, you get these weird elliptical little circular pieces that don't go anywhere. They have no sense of direction. They're short. They're kind of tongue in cheek. There's nothing sublime about them. They're kind of lightly ironic. They're peculiar. They're idiosyncratic. They're transparent. And there's something really ineffable about them where you can't quite put your finger on exactly what it is he's doing.
Mm.
So they're very playful.
Yeah.
And I think that was a quality that they viewed as being in need maybe of emphasizing.
Mm.
Debussy maybe not as much as Satie. I wouldn't particularly say that Debussy is, playful and humorous in his work. But both of them very much saw themselves as French artists defending a very French vision of culture and doing so in opposition to Germanic aesthetics.
Mm. Yeah, because it's funny because Satie he was I mean or yeah, I guess his friends essentially were Stravinsky, Debussy, Ravel, and so it's like it's funny that these very important composers kind of I mean, I'm not sure entirely what they thought of. Well, I mean, I know Debussy really liked Satie, but anyway, it's just interesting that they all kind of had a dialogue with Satie at one point or another.
Well, it comes back to what we were saying at the beginning of our conversation about scenes, the importance of scenes.
Mm.
It's like there are times when uh, something just happens in a particular city at a particular moment. There's, like the Vienna of Freud and Egon Schiele and Mahler. It's like and Georg Trakl and Adolf Loos and all of these people that know each other and participate in this profound intellectual ferment. And that happens sometimes in a particular location at a particular time. And it's to a degree, you have to be historically lucky. You have to be, in the right place at the right time. But these people will find themselves. They will gravitate towards each other. It happened in the 1910s and 1920s with the so-called lost generation. All of these artists, many of whom were international figures like Hemingway and Joyce and Gertrude Stein and George Antile and you know uh, all finding themselves in Paris in the interwar period. And uh, yeah, it's totally fascinating to read about how they knew each other and how they affected each other's work and imagine the sorts of conversations they must have had. And uh, how can you not be interested in that?
Yeah, right, right, right. Um, so I guess going off of that, or how does aesthetics play a role in your work, or personal aesthetics play a role in your work?
I don't think about aesthetics. You just do the things you want to do and the things that you're drawn to investigating. And I suppose the aesthetics are a second order consequence of that.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm driven fundamentally by curiosity, and I like to do things that I don't know how to do or that, to my knowledge, haven't been done. I like to I like to explore dark corners and see what's there. You
Yeah.
know, it's like if you're walking through a city and you come to an intersection that you're not familiar with, and you do not know what's around the corner because you don't have X-ray vision. So like the only way to find out is to take a left turn and then go for a walk, and you'll see what's there. And that's always been how I operate, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
And you know, that's it's a different set of it's a different set of criteria, right? Because it's not motivated primarily by what could I do that other people will like, or what could I do that I could sell, or what could I do that will slot into the prevailing professional circumstances. I'm not good at doing any of those things, which has meant that I've not been particularly successful at playing a certain institutional game. But you know, everybody will have their own set of priorities, and I've operated the only way that I can, the only way I know how, and I've tried to pursue my obsessions and the things that manifest themselves to me as being important or interesting or captivating or whatever it is. And I have no doubt that a lot of the results of that will be of only marginal interest to other people, but
Right.
there it is.
I also wanted to talk to you about about visual art. How can music interact um, in, I mean, saying it in that way, I guess, it makes it seem like more visual, but how can, um, I guess, how do you, I guess, get um, get some like maybe say inspiration from a certain painting to make a piece? Because I know, like, talking to you, you've mentioned paintings that really interested you. So could you talk a little bit about that?
All art is an activity of the human spirit, and you could think of the human spirit as being like a massive river with all of these tributaries. Um, and the form that it happens to take is immaterial. I mean, you might be more drawn to one medium over another because of psychological characteristics or because of circumstances or whatever, but there's no difference to me between a painting, a photograph, a musical composition, a poem, a novel, a film. They're all manifestations of the same thing. And they're all born fundamentally out of a desire to explore inner space as much as exploring the world itself. So you can take inspiration from all sorts of things. It doesn't matter what they are. Um, you can go down weird rabbit holes. You know, you can become really interested in the history of whatever, baseball trading cards or something.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that much. Uh, what I'm interested in is uh, I am very interested in artists that are idiosyncratic, that are driven by a vision, that do things differently because they have to do them differently, and who express a vision that is really distinctive, who just do things differently than other people because they see the world differently. And that, again, that's probably because I'm hardwired to be interested in things like that. But
Hmm.
yeah, and a lot of it comes not so much out of facility or talent per se, but out of uh, a creative response to a problem or a limitation of some kind. So I'll give you an example. I often talk about the painter Barnett Newman, an American abstract expressionist painter, who's known primarily for doing these quite large format color field paintings. And if you look at the early work of Barnett Newman, which consists of some oil paintings, but mostly drawings, you quickly realize that he couldn't draw his way out of a paper bag. He was a very limited draftsman. Um, and he must have known that. And in the early part of his life, he was, a kind of a dilettante and a critic and a writer. And he hung out with artists, but he wanted to make art himself. But he didn't really have much ability. So, um, but he had a vision and he had, the desire to do it. And he was very interested in aesthetics and very interested in art. And so he made these, he had a kind of epiphany in the 50s where he realized uh, he could make these paintings with very simple compositions, but focusing on qualities of light, translucency, opacity, and material qualities of paint, and really get into that. And out of that limitation came a body of work that is actually really unique, and making things that nobody else had made or has made since. And I find the paintings totally incredible. And it partly just it comes out of a limitation and a creative response to a problem. So nobody will ever tell you, oh, Barnett Newman was, a draftsman equivalent to Picasso. He wasn't. He was very limited. But within those limitations, he adopted those limitations as a creative badge of honor and pushed them as far as he possibly could. And some very interesting work came out of that. So I'm kind of interested in figures like that, or the photographer William Eggleston. If you look at Eggleston is still alive. He's 85, and he's an American pioneer of color photography, which in the 60s and 70s was simply like no fine art photographers were interested in color. It just wasn't done. Like photography, if it was serious, was in black and white, period. And color was for advertisements and holiday snapshots. And he changed all that, and he produced a body of work that you look at it, and it's kind of troubling because when you first look at his pictures, you're like, so he's photographing a ceiling, or he's photographing a corner of the sidewalk, or a tricycle on the street, or a motel sign, like all of this stuff that is not, normally the subject of fine art photography. And you look at it and it's like, well, these kind of look like snapshots, but they're not because they're imbued with this weird power and this weird aesthetic quality that is, that completely transcends what a snapshot would normally be. And that's another example of like it's a guy. It just happens that he lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and he was surrounded by this kind of endless suburban sprawl and this ugliness and these dilapidated buildings, and that was his environment. And his work is a creative response to that with just a investigation of, well, here's what's actually here, and here's a way to look at it that nobody's looked at it before.
Mm.
I could go on and on. There's so many examples of poets and painters and photographers and movie makers who have just had to come to grips with a limitation and or the particularities of the situation they found themselves in, and they evolved. This is an adaptive strategy, right? They evolved a technique that allowed them to flourish in whatever their circumstances were and whatever their limitations were. Right. So you could perhaps argue that there are two ways of imagining this. There's the artist who, like Picasso, achieves a kind of transcendent technical mastery
Yeah.
and starts there, right? And then deploys that mastery across many different forms. And then there's the artist who starts with a particular problem or a very particular set of circumstances or a particular limitation and evolves a technique in response to that. Now, that makes me think of animals like tube worms, which are these weird creatures that live at the bottom of the sea.
Hmm.
You know, it's like they've evolved the particular morphology that they have and the particular uh, uh, ways of gathering nutrition because of the environment that they live in. You know, they're attached to the bottom of the ocean floor, and so they have to extract nutrients. You know, despite the circumstances that they have. And some artists, that's their lot in life. It's like they don't start from that kind of transcendent virtuosity, the ability to do anything. Rather, it's like, well, here I am stuck to the bottom of the ocean floor, and I have to survive.
Yeah, right. I know I'm kind of jumping around a bit, but I wanted to actually touch on Lachman for a second. So, you mentioned before that Lachman's music is very difficult to transport to other countries. Yeah, I was wondering if you could elaborate on that uh, because I can understand that he's coming. A lot of the stuff he's coming out of is well, he grew up in dilapidated Germany, I guess, and from World War II. Um, so I mean, I feel like I can understand from a, I guess maybe an intellectual level, but partly. So I was wondering if is there anything else I'm missing, I guess.
Well, again, Lachenmann comes out of a very, very unique set of circumstances. He was born during the war, I think in 38 or 39. I don't remember his exact birth year, but during World War II in Germany. And he studied with Luigi Nono. And Nono was a communist with very strong, you know, obviously left-leaning political convictions and a particular way of looking at the world. And he was that's the environment that he came out of, you know,
Hmm.
and his work has to be understood against that backdrop. You know, when Lachenmann writes a piece for cello in which there isn't a single conventional cello sound that you hear, but rather all of these sort of marginal ways of playing the cello, or when he writes a piano piece like Guero, which is a very early piano piece he wrote at the beginning of his career, where it's a compendium of noises played on a piano, but without really any conventional piano sounds being heard. Um,
Yeah.
well, I think, you know, if you're not from and of those particular circumstances, and you're in a completely different part of the world in a completely different time, then you need to at least understand the context and why he was doing that and what it's all about and what he was responding to. And I think, you know, it's certainly possible, as you would hope, you know, with any major work of art, it's possible to appreciate it purely for its surface characteristics and enjoy it as a composition. But in the case of Lachenmann, I think the historic circumstances are so particular and so extreme that it is important to understand them in order to come to grips with what he was doing. And you have to understand the ideas surrounding it as well, and the influence of Nono. So I think there are aspects of Lachenmann's music which respond to a very particular set of circumstances that don't necessarily export all that well.
Hmm.
So his work is in large part a response to German art music and the classical music world of that time. And he's trying to sort of show, you know, a metaphor that I've heard a bunch of times with respect to Lachenmann is it's as though you don't look at the Mona Lisa, but rather you flip it around and you look at the backside of the canvas instead. And what do you see then? Well, you see instead of the image of the artwork itself, you see all the material traces that went into the making of the artwork. You see the stains of the oil seeping through the canvas. You see the wooden frame. You see the nails holding it together. You see the threads in the canvas, and you see a kind of ghostly outline of the central figure in the Mona Lisa.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what he's doing in his work, is he's de-emphasizing the surface qualities of the music and foregrounding the material traces of how those things come into being in the first place. And in terms of the classical instruments for which he writes, those material traces are, as he describes it, the collision of fingers, horsehair, and strings in a string quartet. It's all the noises that are normally minimized or suppressed when you produce a sound. It's the breath noises, it's the scraping sounds, it's the bow, the horsehair striking the string, but de-emphasizing tone. Right?
Yeah.
It's as though the most prominent characteristics have been turned into the most peripheral characteristics. He's just flipped it around. So interestingly, and I know that Lachenmann himself has found this very problematic. There have been multiple generations of students now who've taken that body of work as a kind of playground from which to uh, extract sound effects, but
Yeah.
divorced of any particular purpose, or divorced of the context that his work was done in the first place. And um,
Yeah.
to some extent, you could say that's par for the course, because if you come up with a strikingly new artistic language and you invent all kinds of things that nobody's heard before, then you're going to get a legion of imitators you know, who are extracting the gold that is the hard-won discoveries you've made, and doing things with them, and that's fair enough, right? Because creative people steal all the time.
Yeah.
But when it becomes very, very, very widespread and it turns into a mannerism, but a mannerism that no longer has any connection to the original impulse that led to the creation of the work, then the danger is it can become hollowed out and meaningless and hackneyed. And unfortunately, I think that has happened with a lot of work that has emerged in the wake of Lachenmann.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. Because because before I got a sense that I guess I was twisting the meaning of what you were saying before about Lacherman, um, where I got a sense that um, you were maybe saying that you had to be born German to understand his music. And I was like, how
No,
can that
no,
be
not at all.
possible? Yeah.
No, no, no. You don't have to be born German. Uh, it has nothing to do with that. It just has to do with the you could expand this discussion to almost anything. So, for example, there are a lot of people who very understandably find it very difficult to enter into the world of the early Boulez pieces, the second piano sonata, the sonatine for flute and piano, uh, Le Marteau sans maître, and so on. And it's no wonder, right? There are musical languages, there are artistic languages that I think have a certain universal power, and others that are maybe more difficult to access, or more rebarbative, or more maybe specifically tied to a particular time and place. And in the case of Boulez, you have to understand, or you have to try to understand, what it would be like to be 20 years old
Yeah.
in post-war Paris, in post-war Europe, right? When, you know, Western civilization has very nearly been brought to its knees completely,
Right.
and all of these cities are in ruins. And all of the cultural assumptions that were prevalent in the era leading up to that have suddenly been violently brought into question, right? So, in a lot of people's minds, it's like, okay, late 19th century aesthetics seem to dovetail with some of the attitudes that brought about the catastrophe of World War II. What's with that? What are we to do with late 19th century aesthetics? How are we supposed to build a path forward? And you get things like the second piano sonata. It comes out of that. Whether it happened deliberately and consciously, or as an unconscious response to the circumstances he was in, is a separate question. But it's like if you have no concept of that and you just approach it as you would approach any other piece of music, then you may find it disorienting, unpleasant, and confusing, and not be particularly interested in looking any further.
Right, right. Yeah.
So the point in common between Boulez and Lachenmann is the Second World War was obviously an exceptional and very unique moment in human history that had profound consequences for all of the arts. And the individuals who were young, either when it happened or in the immediate aftermath of it, had their entire worldview, their entire concept of aesthetics shaken to the core and shaped by that one event. And so when you have much younger people living in a completely different part of the world who may not necessarily understand that history and are looking at those artworks from a purely aesthetic standpoint,
Yeah. Mm.
without necessarily understanding the circumstances and the attitudes that shaped them, then I think you're missing a big part of the puzzle.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Uh, I mean, yeah, considering the, well, many things, I guess, about those works. This brings about another sort of analysis question to mind, where Werner Herzog, the film director, once said that um, to make a good film, you need to watch bad films. And do you think that can translate to, I guess, music or the arts in general?
You don't have to go out of your way to listen to bad music because we're surrounded by it all the time. And most of the work being produced in any given era is bad work. And that's just it's just like it's a law of averages.
Yeah, but what about, right? But what about analysis though? Like purposely,
Should
um,
you analyze bad works?
yeah.
I think you should analyze anything that raises a set of pertinent questions in your mind. And that could include works that are problematic or that are lacking in a particular direction. So, for example, it's a bit of a trope that Mussorgsky's harmony is gauche. It's not very good harmony.
Mm,
There is something very very peculiar about his harmony. There's no question. When you look at it closely, as I've done, you discover that it's not so much that it's gauche exactly, or that it's ill-conceived somehow, but he had a very very peculiar ear and strange ways of joining chords together. And if you look at them and try to figure out why he chose the chords he did and why he voiced them the way he did, um, it turns out they're actually quite interesting, and you can derive things from them technically.
mm,
Um, so that might be an example. Like in other words, you might look at something that you see as being uh, unsatisfactory in a particular dimension, and then try to understand, well, why is that the case? Is it purely a limitation of the artist? Is it a lapse in their technique? Or was there maybe an aesthetic intention behind it? Or were they trying to, do the best they could with a limited technique?
mm,
What I find interesting are works that are very interesting in certain respects, but also simultaneously problematic in other respects. Those are the works that tend to really captivate me for long periods of time because they're not wholly satisfying. Like a work like the St. Matthew Passion, which is obviously a high watermark in the Western musical tradition. It's one of the greatest things Bach ever composed, if not the greatest. Uh, a work like that, which we've absorbed as a culture, and we universally recognize its greatness.
right.
In a sense, a work like that is not hugely problematic because it's straightforwardly a masterpiece. But there are also pieces where they have a greatness to them, but they don't quite settle into that kind of unanimous declaration of greatness. There's something about them that isn't quite you know. And I have that with a lot of Boulez pieces, with Le Marteau sans Maître, which is one of my favorite scores, but it's got some problems. And so I keep returning to it, partly to see if, well, is it me or is it the piece? Uh, and it's like you can't stop listening because on one level it's incredibly captivating,
Yeah.
and at the same time it's also simultaneously very frustrating. And pieces like that, again, I tend to return to them. Or the late no pieces like Prometeo, or the string quartet,
Mm.
which are very, very long, slow works in which very little happens. On the face of it, they can be very boring to listen to, but there's also something that makes me keep returning to them. So that's what you might call the problematic artwork, the artwork that raises questions, the artwork that encourages you to think, well, how would I have responded to this aesthetic? What would I have done? How would I have done it differently? What can I learn from this? Why is it problematic? And why am I still interested in it despite the aspects of this language that I find unsatisfactory?
Right, right, yeah. Yeah, and
As far as work that's just genuinely bad or just banal, then I, I I find it very difficult to be interested enough to give it any serious or sustained attention.
mm-mm. Well, you once mentioned to me that you had a difficult time with Philip Glass. So I was hoping to maybe ask you um if you've resolved that at all.
No, I haven't resolved it. My concern with Philip Glass was, first of all, never to give in to the contemptible snobbishness that has contaminated a lot of the critical response to his music. So there are many people who are incredibly snobbish about Glass for all sorts of reasons because they perceive him as being contaminated by the commercial world, making music that is, not serious, not sufficiently serious, or that is, uh, too easy to listen to, or whatever. And you always have to be suspicious of that. Because none of those are aesthetic criteria, and none of those have anything to do with whether a work is successful or not. You can have you can be born with a gift of infallible commercial instincts
Hmm.
and write fantastic work. It's got nothing to do with the quality. Like, some people have commercial instincts, and good for them. I don't have that. I've never had that. I have no concept of what the popular imagination is interested in. I can't tap into it. I don't have that capacity. Some people do, and that's a gift. We should be grateful for people who can do that.
Yeah, I mean you're sort
So,
of
so the
getting at
first thing
right?
I, d- I don't I wouldn't say that. What not,
Yeah.
no, but anyway.
No, I understand. I understand. Yeah.
So with respect to Glass, there are a lot of composers who are reacting to his work out of jealousy because he's very famous, he's very successful, and he's had a spectacular career. So that's the first thing. Don't ever respond to artworks out of spite or jealousy or reacting against someone's success. And I've been very careful not to do that with Glass. And if anything, I think we should all be grateful for artists like him who are able to tap into the popular imagination, because that's an achievement, and almost no one can do that. So that's the first thing. Now, as for the work itself, we have to carefully separate those two things.
Yeah.
So I heard a performance of Einstein on the Beach in Paris at the Théâtre du Châtelet, and this was about 10 years ago.
Like as an
And I was
oratorio or
no, as a staged
oh,
performance.
okay, okay.
Yeah, yeah, a fully staged performance. And I was deeply impressed with that. I thought this is really a very striking artwork. I was not bored for 1 second. I was completely engaged with it, and it was unlike anything I had ever experienced. So hats off to anybody who can do that, because most people can't. And it was very, very impressive indeed. Other things I've heard by him have impressed me less.
Yeah.
And I haven't engaged with, like, he's produced a lot of work over the years. And to be totally candid with you, there are aspects of the style that for me are difficult. So when music is either very repetitive or where the harmony is very simple to a degree where my ear just kind of shuts off because it's not got enough to, I don't know, it doesn't have enough interest for me to sustain it. Then I find it difficult. I just shut off. I find it very difficult to listen. Um, and I've often had that experience with glass, or I've had the impression that while the aesthetics and the style are unique and extremely interesting, the work itself doesn't always hold my attention. But I'll just conclude by saying that I don't know his work well enough to offer any more of a judgment beyond that. There's a lot that I haven't heard. I haven't heard many of his film scores, for example, and those are held to be some of his best work. I haven't
Yeah.
heard all his operas. I've mainly heard chamber music, concertos, Einstein on the Beach, and a few other things, and pieces like Mad Rush and the piano etudes. And so, so that's my very incomplete impression, which is that, Einstein on the Beach is for me of what I've heard, it's a high watermark, very interesting artwork. There are lots of other pieces that simply don't hold my attention, despite repeated attempts.
Hmm. Yeah. So how do you think composers can get a wider audience, gain a wider audience?
By not being preoccupied with an audience.
Mm-mm.
If you're obsessed with achieving popularity, you probably won't achieve it because you'll be trying to emulate things that other people have done that have succeeded in the past. And that's not how people become popular. They become popular by doing things uh, that are distinctive, but that also resonate with the popular imagination at the time that they're being made. Like you,
Yeah.
to a degree, I don't think that's something that you can just do. I think you have to be lucky, maybe. And sometimes maybe it's not even so lucky for that to happen because if you achieve massive popularity, there's a whole set of constraints and challenges that come with that as well. It's not necessarily easy to navigate.
Right.
And for some artists, the best thing for them is to toil away in obscurity for 20 years without anybody paying attention. And the reason for that is, like you can get a lot of work done if nobody's bothering you. Like you
Yeah.
can actually sit down and concentrate and not be distracted by professional obligations and people expecting a certain type of work from you. And because that can really, if you're really sensitive, that can do you in. You know,
Yeah.
that's
Right.
happened with a lot of popular artists. Like they achieve a huge success, like in the pop world. Like this is a well-known phenomenon. Like imagine you have a smash hit, and it's everywhere, and for the rest of your life, all anybody wants is for you to get up on stage and sing that one song over and over and over again, decade after decade. It's like that's really rough for artists. So sometimes, you know, just being left alone and pursuing your idiosyncratic vision, and eventually maybe people will catch up and take an interest in it. That's what happened with Vivian Meyer. Vivian Meyer was a one of the great street photographers,
Mm.
and she was a nanny. That was her profession. She looked after the children of wealthy people in Chicago, and whenever she could, which was a couple of hours every day, she would go out on long walks through Chicago, and she had a twin reflex Rolleiflex camera that she brought with her, and uh, and took some of the most amazing street photos of the whole century. And she got better at it with time. She became a real master of that genre, but she didn't show the work to anybody. And so what happened was she had this room that was filled with tens of thousands of negatives, which she often didn't even bother to develop. And purely by accident, this trove of work, which was her life's work, was discovered after her death by an archivist who
Mm.
then digitized the negatives and had them processed and developed and all of that. And it turned out that here's this spectacular body of work. And it's like it was done in total isolation without any professional ambitions whatsoever. And there it is. It's like this incredible legacy that she left behind. So
Yeah,
she's popular now. She'll never know that she was popular.
maybe.
Maybe.
Right, right. Yeah, I want to ask you, what are you working on now as an artist?
Right now I'm writing piano piece number 13.
Mm,
So anybody who is interested can go on my YouTube channel, and I published a video about 3 months ago of the pianist Dina Pisarenko playing my complete piano pieces, which is an ongoing series I'm working on. I've written 12 so far, and right now I'm working on number 13, and I published them in groups of four. So the next volume will be 13 to 16. Um, and prior to that, I wrote a song cycle on poems by Daniel Bradley, as I mentioned earlier, and a long piece for solo cello and two pieces for violin. So those are the most recent pieces I've written.
mm,
And piano piece 13 is causing me no end of trouble because it's a very significant departure for me, technically and aesthetically, which I suppose is in keeping with the project of the piano pieces more generally, because
yeah.
they're really, what would you call it? It's like a field diary. It's me trying things out, and it's a, each piece is different from all the others, but 13 is really different from all the others. And so it's been very slow going because I'm in unknown territory here and I don't know what I'm doing. But,
Yeah.
it's like you pull a thread and you have to find out where it goes.
Yeah, she's a really fantastic pianist. Yeah, how'd you find her? Because I mean, uh ever since hearing, that from that video you mentioned, um just yeah, she's just so good, you know.
In my professional life as a composer, there have been a handful of performers, I can count them on the fingers of one hand, uh, who are so utterly singular, and who have a kind of profound identification with what I'm trying to do. And that is a gift from the heavens when that happens, because most of the time it doesn't happen.
Mm, yeah.
And what you'll find, and you, maybe not you specifically, but anyone who's listening to this who's a musician, is that when that happens, if you have the good fortune to have someone appear on your path that understands what you're trying to do and is in phase with it, then grab them and don't let go, because you need that as a composer. Like all the public hears is the performance. They don't read your scores, they don't understand the inside of your head. All they hear is the performance. And if the performance doesn't bring out the essence of what you're trying to do, then your work will never be understood, or it'll be understood incompletely or superficially.
Mm,
So I met Dina for the first time in 2018. Uh, I was invited to conduct a masterclass in Kiev, Ukraine, and also to have that piano piece you mentioned, the À propos du concert de la semaine dernière, was programmed, and it was played in a really nice concert hall in Kiev by an ensemble that I then subsequently did an album with. So I made two trips to Ukraine, and on both occasions I got to work closely with Dina and to get to know her. And I was instantly struck by her approach to my pieces and her performances generally, which were of an almost demonic level of intensity and identification with the material. I mean, it was stunning. I'd never heard anything like it.
yeah.
And so, that was a no-brainer. It's like, this is obvious. I want to work with this person. Uh, and so I sent her my piano pieces, and she was interested in them and started working on them. And Dina doesn't do things halfway. She doesn't sort of look at a piece for a couple of weeks and then, you know, throw it onto a recital program. But in the case of the piano pieces, it was years, and she spent years with them, and really, because there's 12 of them, it's 45 minutes of music or more. I can't remember. Maybe it's even longer than that, but it's a lot of music, and they're really challenging pieces. They're very hard to play, most of them anyway. Even the easy ones are hard, actually. Uh, and she just got right to the quick of it, and understood the essence of the pieces and what I was trying to do, and was able to communicate them forcefully. So the next logical step was to do a video showing her playing all 12 of them. So that's a collaboration that I hope will go on for a very long time to come.
But yeah, I encourage anyone to go and listen to those recordings with Dina. And also, you have a video interview with her on your channel.
Yes, I do. That's right. That's right.
It's pretty
Yeah.
fascinating. And um, thank you for taking the time to talk to me, Samuel. It's been a great pleasure. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. You asked very interesting questions, and it's always good to talk with you, Patrick. And thank you for the invitation. I hope your podcast continues to grow and to do well. And I'm a fan. I'm following it myself. So good luck with all of that, and of course with your own compositions.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, and anyone who's interested, well, first go check out Samuel's channel, which I'll link it in the description. Also, I have a Patreon account, and if you want to check that out, then put that down there too. So, thank you everyone for watching. Bye bye.